My name is Larry Rosenthal, and I am with the Goldman School of Public Policy at UC Berkeley, which is a graduate school of public policy that offers Masters in Public Policy, Masters in Public Affairs, and PhD programs, as well as an undergraduate minor in public policy. I was trained as a lawyer, and then I came back to school to study public policy, got a PhD. And most of my career I've been concentrating on housing and the urban economy in my research. And in recent years I've been thinking also about problems of democracy. I do a lot of different things at the school where I'm a senior lecturer. I'm also the program director of the Center on Civility and Democratic Engagement, among other roles that I have. Right now, the extra time that I'm having around my teaching schedule is mostly devoted to online education. I'm working on an online course that we fielded several years ago on the platform called edX, which is a company in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And the topic is solving public policy problems. It's our 8-fold path method. And so I am busy with a project upgrading that course and fielding it to international audiences. So I'm working on that. I'm supervising some research on community-based politics and social change, and have a handful of other things that I'm writing grants for. But I'm not writing anything more than a long-winded book proposal on the intersection between incivility and public policy systems. Well, this is a very important topic, which you can call affordability if you're thinking about folks who are renting or buying. If you believe that the solution to housing challenges is boosting home ownership, then you'd be thinking about the affordability of houses and mortgages. If you're worried about the affordability challenges facing renters, then you'd be worried about housing assistance for renters, what we call housing assistance vouchers, and also trying to address oneself to the problem of supply. It's a devilishly complicated issue. When the price of housing goes up, it makes landlords and owners very happy. It actually improves their wealth. And in equal measure, it makes life more difficult for families that are struggling to afford rent or struggling to afford mortgage payments. Interestingly enough, we wrote a long report for the National Association of Realtors several years ago. And the question then, as it is now, is what are we going to do about the housing crisis or the affordability crisis? And we did some archival research in the newspapers, and we found mention of an affordability crisis in the Bay Area in 1949. So is it a crisis or is it just a way of life? One of the things that we know about the Bay Area and other wonderful places to live around the world is that there's a lot of demand. There's a lot of people who want to move there, and in the Bay Area and elsewhere, we're not building housing fast enough to meet the demand simply because a lot of people want to live here and they're willing to pay to be here. But beyond that, I think I would only add to this long-winded answer that we have been very concerned about the built environment. And we have about a 50-year-old regulation here called the California Environmental Quality Act, which goes CEQA, CEQA, and it causes slower and more expensive development, which from an environmental standpoint we like, because then we're making sure that each and every new building is being mindful of its environmental impact. However, making housing slower in production and more expensive is not good for affordability. It's a very interesting topic, but unless you're paying rent or paying a mortgage, you might not be directly involved. I think it's a great question, and whenever we ask how to set a balance between competing interests in public policy, a number of politically savvy observers would say, not only how do we do it, who gets to do it? And typically, we have allowed local governments to set the balance between the free market price of a home and the regulation of who gets to build what where. And traditionally in the cities we see a much more diverse world politically in terms of the distribution of political power, but also a wider variety of people, incomes, neighborhoods, and housing types. In the United States, as elsewhere, when we've seen the suburbanization of the population and the flight from city centers of jobs, of capital, of wealth, it has been the case that higher wealth individuals have been able to create enclaves in the suburbs and essentially have been able to ward off entry by folks who are of lesser means, folks who are unlike them on cultural, ethnic, or even racial indicators, and beyond that, simply the division between a single family type of a land use plan where there's big lawns and lots of room and lots of space, we're all living here in this big park, versus a far more compact, dense, multifamily plan, which will use land more efficiently because we're going to build higher, but will also allow more people of different backgrounds and different incomes to join. If a student's interested in kind of the latest trends in this field, one would want to learn a little bit about the history of zoning regulation, because that is the regulatory feature that allows local government to say you can't build this here, you can't build that there, and that's called zoning. But beyond that, in the last year or so, more and more localities in the United States, and even conversations at the state level, are thinking about maybe reforming zoning wholesale and taking away from these localities the capacity to fence themselves off from society and protect their wealth and protect their, quote, way of life, which I don't like saying, but I've heard them say it during city council battles and the like. And for example, pending in Oregon is a proposal that we just somehow undo zoning for everybody, allow the market to operate. Very interesting proposal, and represents really a policy revolution in this field. We've had a lot of opportunity to try to measure zoning systems and decide which are more inclusionary, which are more exclusionary, which more deter new development, and which are kind of more hospitable to new development. We've always had the hunch that folks exercise zoning regulation and make their permissible building policies restrictive to protect themselves. In a sense, they're kind of acting like a monopoly, if you want to think about that. Here we are in Berkeley. There's only one place that can supply Berkeley to the world, its unique flavor, its unique character. The Berkeley City Council will decide who gets to build what. And they're behaving like any other monopoly power in the economy would behave. They may be acting selfishly in their own self-interest. If you have enough small places doing that, you may end up with outcomes that are not good for anybody on the whole. That question takes us deeper, I think, into the complexities of the land use policy and housing policy questions. Well, I would have to study Jeonse and the built environment more carefully. Yeah. I think that it's the rare national government that has really attended to these transitional questions you're talking about. They've trusted the economy to allocate the goods of society, the advantages of society, and it's the competition among people, especially in these evolved, developed economies. The notion is that the competition among people will be for the greatest good. And that if folks are getting the short end of the economic goods, that they will simply work harder. That so long as you have economic mobility, one generation's suffering will cause greater wealth for future generations. I would have a hard time approaching the built environment in Korea without assuming that there'd been some government policy that already set those densities, that already approved certain kinds of housing and rejected other kinds of housing. It sounds like the Jeonse, am I pronouncing it correctly?
It starts with a J, so it's
The Jeonse.
Yeah.
The Jeonse policy sets a price floor. In a sense, what we're saying is we don't trust the market to give a fair rate of return. We, the government, intervene and say, you have to pay at least 70% of the cost of building it originally.
Yeah.
And that's not a free market plan. That's protect the seller plan, protect the landlord plan. So is that because of a disequilibrium politically, where those interests are overrepresented in the legislature, or overrepresented in the bureaucracy? It has to be the case that a price floor is going to advantage the producers and sellers and disadvantage the buyers. So one would drive into the analysis of that policy by asking, when we create that distortion, what do we think we're getting? In general, and again, I'm kind of just framing what the analysis might be like without knowing more, and pardon me for not knowing more about the Korean example. A ready example of setting a price floor comes to mind, and that is dairy products in the US's depression in the 1930s. There was this idea that the economy was so weak and we were having negative growth. People were on the street waiting in bread lines. The firms were not adjusting. The lending markets were in pieces. Folks weren't investing anymore. They were hiding their money under their beds rather than putting those dollars at risk in the investment economy. In the middle of all that, you have these great concerns about the children, and that the children, in order to develop according to the public health standards of the time, they need milk. What can the government do to ensure a supply of healthy, wholesome, nutritive milk for children? I know we can declare what the price is, and we can force the market to spend a high enough price that will essentially be floating a safety net beneath the industry. And the industry will say, aha, we have a price guarantee. We can grow, we can invest more, we can make sure that cows live longer, we can buy more arable land to feed the cows, we can build more buildings to milk the cows. And without that kind of government signal, it's not a government investment. Simply, it's a government saying the price of milk is hereby twice what it is now in the market. The other thing the government did, of course, is to buy milk and to buy cheese. So with these two strategies, the government can really prop up industries that may be suffering in free market conditions. So go back to the history of the creation and implementation of the Jeonse.
Yeah.
Of the Jeonse policy. Was the housing market suffering a depression?
I'm guessing so, yeah. Because Korea was in like a really, it was like economic regression, and then they started having like new policies, and I think those were one of the policies that they
We have these allocative issues, distributional issues.
Yeah.
Governments declare policies much easier than they repeal them. So if we venture the kind-hearted guess about government policy at the time, it was well struck, well calibrated for the purpose, wasn't born of unfair political advantage for the beneficiaries, namely the landlords and producers of housing. And we made a good decision as a society, and we stabilized the housing market. Now, that faction of folks who are unequally or disproportionately benefited they kind of get addicted to the assistance. They get addicted to the advantage, and then they fight to keep it, even though the macroeconomic social justification in the public interest writ large has kind of attenuated and fallen away. Why are we propping up industries that don't need the propping up anymore? This is a question. But again, this is all, I think, just a sketch of what I think I'm hearing. I would need to read some literature about Jeonse
I think that's an
to
amazing
understand
answer,
it.
yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, because all the other articles into those were also kind of like in that direction.
Sure.
Yeah.
You can approach all of this from the notion of kind of regulated industries.
Yeah.
And what we do as a government. It's clear that in these developed economies, we're not operating truly free markets. We are operating political economies. Mm-hmm. And if you major in political economy, you're basically studying two systems: the system by which we utilize representative democracy, parliamentary forms, whatever our system looks like, to influence social choice. But we're also liking the benefits of a free economy. We know the economy needs certain rules applied, so the government's going to take that on. But we're also going to make these adjustments, such as monetary policy at a central bank. And so these are all blended systems. And this line drawing that we were discussing about local zoning earlier, it's the same thing that you would need to do at the national level to make, big regulatory adjustments. So what do? The Trump tariffs are a really cool example. When the Trump administration has been slapping tariffs on agricultural sales, the growers in the United States have been suffering. What are you going to do to help them? Eliminate the tariff? No, we like the foreign policy advantages of the tariff. We're just going to set aside a subsidy for the folks who are suffering. So do you have that compensatory ethic in mind? The young people, the Generation Z, the millennials, they're having a hard time entering these housing markets. What are we going to do? Well, if you want your industry benefiting, stabilizing supports, maybe you should also be investing to help new participants in those markets enter them by giving down payment assistance for home buyers and that kind of thing. Adjusting some kind of means tested opportunity where we're going to soften the 70 or 80% requirement for the least income folks. You can do all sorts of things and try to adjust the blend. But one of the things we're teaching in public policy is you started out distorting the market. Now you want to distort the distortion. It can get pretty messy. I've done a little work on disasters. I want to let you know about the site of this interview. It's taking place in California Memorial Stadium. One of the very interesting features of this building is that it's already broken in half. Okay. And more broadly, the campus itself has utilized seismic mitigation strategies that vary by building. So you're actually looking out at the campus at a seismic laboratory, ready for the next big shaker. And we'll see how these different engineering systems actually perform, which is really interesting. I think in general, if you just want to think about the ingredients to a successful new housing development, one of the things that's always in play is land. And if you tax land more aggressively, you're going to add to the price of housing. If you impose regulations on the seismic safety of structures on land, you can't do that without imposing additional cost. You can't. Unless there's an engineering that says less technology, less building materials is going to lead to a safer house. And I've never seen an analysis that says that. Rather, I need more systems, different systems, better materials, better engineering, a lot of experts being paid. And yes, we're getting seismic safety, but at what cost? More broadly, you ask the question not only about kind of structural resilience for buildings in seismic zones, but also about generally the environmental accounting for any building. So in the federal system, when the environmental revolution occurred and the consciousness was raised, and suddenly we had, under a Republican administration run by a man named Richard Nixon, who was later almost impeached and resigned rather than being impeached. During that time, a moderate Republican by today's standards administration said we need environmental protection and environmental responsibility, created the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, which said if we, the federal government, are going to do any kind of project, we promise to analyze the environmental impacts and make that part of the conversation, part of the evaluation of that proposal. And this has caught on at the state level. So in theory, we always know that a new building has environmental impact. If there was a building there already, we're going to tear that down and put it in a landfill, and put up a new building. All the refuse from the old building, that goes in the landfill. Environmental impact. We're going to bring people, they're going to bring cars. Those cars are going to have emissions. More smog, environmental impact. More people, more congestion. More congestion, more traffic. More traffic, slower moving cars, more pollution per mile. We see these connections between development, proposals, and economic growth on the one hand, and environmental impact on the other. The problem is, I think at the community level, people want both. People want environmental control and environmental growth. They want enough housing for everybody and no environmental impacts. It used to be that environmentalist was someone who was against any building. Why? Because it kind of pushes out animals and plants, it pollutes, and so environmentalism was about restrictions on all development. Now we're moving the needle and saying we need the development, we need to house people. It's inhumane not to house people. What level of environmental change can we tolerate and still meet the needs of our people? That's where the conversation is now. What I see is very clumsy, very expensive regulation where I'm having to account for the environmental impacts of every single sink, every single hallway, every single unit in a multi-unit building, to the point that I'm going to have to pay 100 experts to tell me everything I need to know about this environmental impact, when really what I want is an apartment building. So in a sense, we are at loggerheads because we have multiple conflicting goals, and our ability to kind of divide and conquer and say, we're going to put up with environmental insults because we favor housing. We're not quite there yet in a lot of metropolitan areas. We're still at this tension, and frankly, it's adding cost and making affordability worse. But if we can stop buildings, we're saving the environment. So all I would say for students is line up and list all the wonderful goals you have for public policy. But instead of saying you want them all at once, start to reckon with how any number of wholesome progressive goals actually conflict with one another, and how are you going to make decisions?